This is Meridith. This is Beth. And they're two sisters. They're a remarkable duo who have come to an understanding about addiction and the role of families and enabling through their own painful experience. And they've written about it in this marvelous book, The Real Dope on Dealing with an Addict. This book is down at the bookstore. I've got to tell you, after they were kind enough to come to Morganton earlier and speak to a community collaboration group that we had, and they just took the town by storm. I just wanted them here. I bought some of those books and shared them with some members of my family who have had similar experiences, and it was just a phenomenally powerful experience for my sisters to read this book. Meridith lives in Asheville, Beth lives in Saluda, both in western North Carolina, and they do a great job of working together, passing the microphone back and forth and telling their story up here in a dynamic and exciting way. I just want to share one part of this that really spoke to me, and I hope it'll speak to you. The long road of addiction that life has forced us to walk has beaten us down to the ground. I can't do this. The long road of addiction that has forced us to walk has beaten us down to the ground and brought us back up to a more intimate and deliberate existence on this earth. It has made us understand the value of being as open as we can be, unafraid to ask tough questions, able to listen to hard truths, and glad to take full responsibility for where we are and where we're going. And honestly, we found that it's the only way we really live. I hope you enjoy them and their message as much as we have here before. Thank you very much.
We, my sister and I, are the adult children of alcoholics. I love that term. Don't you love that term? Because it so beautifully describes what happens to a child who's raised in an alcoholic home. I mean, we grow up to be adults, technically, but really, until we understand what happened in that home, until we understand what happened in our lives, and until we take responsibility, we're stuck. Stuck in the world of addiction and stuck in our childhoods. I am what you call an overachiever. I am sure many of you in this room can relate to that term. I don't do anything halfway. And when it comes to the world of addiction, I and my sister, we were born into an overachieving family. To date, 6 male members of our family have died of the disease of addiction. It began with our grandfather, who was an alcoholic. Then our father succumbed to the disease. Then it took our oldest brother. And then my sister and I both lost our first husbands. Hers to drug addiction, mine to alcoholism. And then just a year ago in May, our last surviving brother, who'd suffered from alcoholism for years, shot and killed himself right in front of our 82-year-old mother, a woman who had devoted her life to trying to save him and every other addict in our lives. Yes, the men in our family, they have suffered terribly with the disease of addiction. But never to be left out and not to be undone, the women in our lives suffer from the other half of the disease. And believe me, we think there is another half to this disease, and that is the disease of enabling. My sister and I are chief enablers, and all the women in our lives have suffered from the disease of enabling. And we believe it is a disease that many people you know suffer from, and many people in the world today suffer from. Because the story of our family and our life is not really just a story of addiction. It's the story of addiction and its partner, enabling. And when both of those diseases are present in the family, the tragedy is that the disease is allowed to spread for generations to come. Because what really happened in our family, what truly is our story, is the story of one addict, our grandfather, and the 10, yes, count them 10, enablers who spent their lives, really wasted their lives, either trying to please or trying to save him. And what my sister and I discovered by really watching the addicts and the enablers in our lives is that addiction really touches not just the addict, but the entire family. It impacts everybody in the family. And again, when it's left untreated, it becomes a breeding ground which allows the addiction enabling to happen for generations. And our recovery began when we identified and recognized enabling as truly a disease, and a disease from which we suffer. And it was in that discovery that we started our journey out of the world of addiction. And we discovered 3 very powerful lessons that put us on our road to recovery. 3 things that we believe are the very foundation for our recovery. And what we want to do today is share those 3 very powerful lessons with you. And our hope is that you're able to take those lessons and help others recognize that they suffer from the disease of enabling. But more importantly, use those lessons to put them on the road to recovery. Because it is these 3 lessons that turn our story from one of tragedy to one of true growth and development, and ultimately to joy.
Okay, we're going to have a show of hands. How many of you out there know someone who has tried to save an addict or alcoholic? I mean, really tried. Given up what they wanted. Keep your hands up. Paid the addict's way out of a jam. Made unbelievable excuses all for the addict. Okay, now keep your hands up. Hands up, how many of you out there have been that person? I need more than 2 hands for this. Have you tried to save the addict or alcoholic? Made those dumb excuses. Spent money you didn't have. And for the rest of you out there, I see a 2-hander up there. How many of you out there, raise your hands, have wanted to tell someone trying to save an addict, I told you so. I told you that you cannot control another person. 3 hands, right? Yeah. Wow. Look at that. Look how many of us have been touched by the enabler. Someone willing to give up their own life and any life that gets in their way, all to save an addict. And they can't stop doing it, no matter who tells them to stop, no matter how futile their efforts. When you think about it, it kind of makes sense why an addict stays with an enabler. We pay the bills, we pay the rent, we give them food, we send them to treatment. I mean, that makes sense. When I look back on my life with my first husband, Edward, there we are on our wedding day, and you can see already in the picture, look who's having fun, and look who is getting down to the business at hand. My enabling was well established long before I ever met Edward. Little did I know on that day that what brought us together and what would keep us together was our mutual need to fuel his burgeoning addiction. So when I look back on the 9 years that I was married to him, it makes perfect sense to me why Edward stayed married to me. After all, almost from the beginning, all he had to do was get pills, find more pills, and take more pills. I, on the other hand, I took over all the adult responsibilities of our life. I decided it was my responsibility to make the money, manage the money, cook, clean, and take full responsibility for our child. The more he spent on drugs and his medical needs, the more I sacrificed so that I could pay his bills, so he could go back to the doctor and get more drugs. So looking back on it, why wouldn't an addicted Edward want to be married to me? I mean, wouldn't you want to be married to me? I would want to be married to me. So the addict isn't so crazy. No, what is crazy is why an outwardly functional adult, me, would choose to remain in such a relationship and continue to do things that never, ever resulted in the outcome I said I was looking for. I wasn't on drugs, but look at the choices I was making. What was going on? What was I getting from this relationship? When I look back on it now, my behavior was not the behavior of a sane person. Yet, as a society, we say the addict is the one with the problem. I can honestly say that my thought process during this time was that I was doing the right thing. I was helping him. I was keeping the ship afloat until he got better. I was the hero, I was the martyr, and I got to be a victim. And I was under the delusion that I was in control. The reality was that I was providing smooth sailing for his disease, while my health, our child's security, and our bank account were going down with the ship. Looking at it now, I can see that my behavior was just as sick as the addict's, if not more so. And I was just as driven as the addict to behave in this destructive way. And that brings us to our first lesson on our first revelation on the road to recovery. Lesson 1, embrace, understand, and treat enabling as a disease. Enabling is a disease, and we need to embrace, understand, and treat it as such. Make no mistake, enablers are unhealthy, and if you look closely, you will see that our behavior mimics those of the addict. Eventually, we lie for the addict. We miss work for the addict. We cut ourselves off from family and friends. Our social circle becomes smaller and smaller until it's just us and our addict. We go broke for the addict, to hell with ourselves or the rest of the family, and we let ourselves go physically. In the end, I was as pale and puffy as Edward. The addict is our addiction. Let me repeat that. The addict is our addiction. So you see, enablers do need help, maybe even more so than substance abusing addicts. Because until the enabler in the family understands the role he or she plays in the addiction, there's little hope of recovery for anyone. For those of you in the treatment community, this is powerful information for 2 reasons. 1, it helps you understand just how deep the disease of enabling runs. We're not even using drugs, and yet we are making irrational choices that turn our life and the life of everyone in our family upside down. And 2, because enablers are not impaired by drugs, I believe we can be more easily reached by the treatment community. We don't need to go through medical detox, and we have not poisoned our brains with chemicals. We just need help to lift the fog of denial so we can see the situation and our part in it for what they truly are.
Yes, enabling is a tricky and a very, very destructive disease. And when it is left untreated, it can actually reinvigorate or reignite an addict's recovery. Because make no mistake, we're like addicts. We need our fix, and we will do anything to get it. This is my first husband, Doug. Smart, kind, funny, most of all, really sweet man. He died penniless, alone, in a flea bag motel in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, at the age of 41. Dead from the disease of addiction, dead from cirrhosis of the liver. But long before his journey wound up there, long before his life ended, Doug, who knew that he was sick with the disease of alcoholism, he wanted to recover. He wanted to get better. So much so that he actually put himself into rehab twice. No interference from me. He checked himself in. He made the appointment. And for all of you who work with recovery, you know how big that is for the addict to take that step. One of those times, he'd taken the step and he had to start with the hospital because his skin had become so yellow with jaundice that the whites of his eyes
glowed yellow. And when he stepped through the doors of the hospital, the doctors and the nurses told him, "You won't make it. You're not going to live. You are on the brink of death from alcoholism, and you will never come back." But what the doctors didn't know and what they didn't understand on that day is that alcohol hadn't yet taken his brain, his body, or his spirit. And it was in his spirit that he still had a desire to live. And for the next 60 days in that hospital, he fought. Twice they called me in when they brought in the priest and we stood over his body reading him his last rites. And the doctors pulled me aside and said, "He's not going to make it. You need to make arrangements." But again, they underestimated his spirit. 60 days later, out the door, he walked. And the moment he sat down in the car, I knew I had a different man. Something about him had changed. And he actually out loud expressed a desire to live. My husband was a quiet man who never spoke much. And for him to express a desire to live, I never heard him say that. I was so excited. And sure enough, in the next couple of weeks, he touched no alcohol, he touched no pills. And one fall morning, it was like an Indian summer, we were on the back porch having breakfast and doing something we never did. We were having a conversation. And he opened up to me like he had never opened up to me before. And he said, "I'm so ashamed, so embarrassed. I don't know how I got here. But he said, I do know one thing. I don't want to be here again. I want to live. I want to matter. I want to make a difference. And I want a life with you." Wow. This was my dream too. I couldn't believe that the man and the life and the marriage I wanted was all about to come true. Next day I got home from work and Doug informed me that he'd called AA and he'd gotten a sponsor. He visited the gym and talked to the owner and talked to a personal trainer. He was ready to put his body and his life back on track. Again, I was so excited. My mind started to click. And immediately I started to think, how can I make sure this happens? How can I control the situation? Certainly Doug needs me to make this happen. And the very next day, right after work, I went down to the gym and I paid his membership for the entire year. I hired the personal trainer for the next 6 months. And I came home and I said, "Honey, don't you worry." I whipped out the calendar and I scheduled all our workouts for the next 6 months. I said, "I'm going with you." And in that moment, I really think that I believed that I was helping him. See, he had entered recovery, but I hadn't. Because when I look back on it now, I see a woman who just had to control the situation. A woman who just had to feed her disease of enabling. Because I was so afraid what would happen to me if he didn't need me anymore. But in that moment, I didn't see that. You all know where this is going. Doug never darkened the doors of that gym again. And within 2 weeks, he was drinking. And I didn't understand what happened on that day until years later when I was in therapy for the 1,000th million, I can't even tell you how many times, whining and complaining about how my poor life had turned out and how unfair everything was. And the therapist asked me, she said, "Now, tell me this story again. Was it his recovery or was it your recovery?" Still, I didn't get it. I thought, why is she blaming me for his drinking? I don't understand this. And she went on to ask me and explain to me. She said, "You know, Meridith, every alcoholic and really every human being has a little seed of doubt in them. A little seed of doubt that says, I'm not sure I can do it. I'm not sure I'm good enough. I'm not sure I can make it happen." And in one fell swoop, when you came in and took over, you took a fragile, recovering addict
and you wiped out and reignited that little seed of doubt. Still, I didn't get it. Intellectually, that made sense, but emotionally, I didn't get it. And she said, well, let me ask you this. She said, think of the times when in your life when you've gotten strong, you felt accomplished, and you've made real change. Did they happen because you did it, or because somebody else came in and did it for you? And in that moment, I got it. It was his recovery. And quite frankly, in that moment, I understood that I needed my own. You see, what's challenging about an addict's recovery is all the incredible work that you do. When the addict gets back and ready to enter the real world, if you haven't treated the enabler, we're still back there providing that same toxic environment. And that leads us to lesson 2. That left untreated, enabling fuels addiction. I was providing aid and comfort, and I may have even reignited my husband's addiction, undermined his recovery. The truth is, we'll never know. He may have returned to the bottle without me. It may have never happened. He may have squished his own recovery. But that's almost irrelevant because my disease of enabling stands on its own. And what I learned from that lesson and what I learned from that moment is that the best way that I can show other people that I love and respect them, and quite frankly, show myself that I love and respect myself, is to allow others to grow and develop, and most importantly, fall and get back up, all on their own.
Yes, enabling is the very fuel of the disease of addiction. While the addict is sick, we enablers provide everything they need to keep that illness going. Maybe not the drugs and alcohol directly, but just about everything else. You're still wondering, is enabling really a disease? These 2 photos should put that to rest. It's okay to laugh. The first is my driver's license when I first moved to North Carolina after leaving my husband. I was 37 years old, and I think I look about 57 in that picture, and not a very fun 57 at that. And the second is my driver's license 7 years later. I was 44 years old, and I think you can see from the pictures the anxiety just lifted from my face 7 years after getting out of an addicted situation and going through much therapy and learning about my own enabling. So when I finally did leave my husband for good, it was on my 4th try, I can remember wondering, how did this happen to me? I mean, you've wondered that, right? You know, we've all been there at that point in life where you wind up at a place you never thought you'd be and you have no idea how you got there. Well, that's where I was. I kept telling myself all I ever tried to be was nice. And I had no clue and no insight until how I ended up in one room at my mother's house with my 4-year-old son. Now looking back, I find it hard to believe in those 9 years with Edward that no one else ever told me how I got there either. After all the physicians, psychiatrists, and psychologists, after a 28-day treatment program at a major university hospital with a family component that I attended religiously, not one professional ever sat me down and explained to me my starring role in our family disease. Not one professional ever suggested that I might be the sick one. Now, I concede that I may not have believed them at that point, but at least that seed would have been planted for when I did start wondering. Yes, they spoke of enabling and codependency, but I'm not sure that even those professionals understood the extent of the issue for enablers, the consequences our behaviors have on ourselves, our family, and the addict. In all this treatment, the spotlight was always on the substance abuser. Sitting in that one room at my mother's house with my child and the few possessions I had taken, I did not know that something was wrong with me, but I knew that something was wrong. So I went searching. And with no idea of where to look, I retraced my steps. I looked back over my life and back over my family. Those are our parents. I just think they're so beautiful. My earliest memories of my grandfather, that would have been my father's father, are of a man in a pressed white shirt, cufflinks, and a tie, running around his house in his boxer shorts, screaming at my grandmother. He was very well educated and extremely successful in business, but he was an alcoholic. And instead of calling him on his behavior, my grandmother walked on eggshells to keep the peace in her home. So my father, he learned to walk on eggshells to protect her. Meanwhile, 4, 5, 6-year-old me witnessed all this unhealthy behavior from my grandfather. And by the way, I know this will come as a shock, but as a family, we never talked about any of it. No one ever said that something was wrong with his behavior. So for me, a child witnessing this, I figured his behavior, the way that he treated us, the way that he treated my grandmother, was normal. And even worse, I thought it was acceptable. As my grandfather grew increasingly irrational and impossible to deal with, no one suggested getting him help. No, instead, as a family, we all rearranged our life to keep his alcoholism going. My father simply took responsibility for the things that my grandfather let go. For instance, my father took over my grandfather's business, though he had no desire to do so. And in doing that, he moved my beautiful mother back to southwestern Pennsylvania instead of giving her the life that he had promised her in New York. He did all this because his mother, my grandmother, said, "I need you." The ultimate drug for the enabler, I need you. The result of all this effort was not my grandfather's recovery from alcoholism, surprise, surprise. No, the result, with all these enablers picking up the pieces, how could he even know that there was a problem? No, the result was passive-aggressive behavior in my parents' marriage and we children being exposed to my grandfather's alcoholism. Eventually, but not surprisingly, our sweet father, who had stuffed his feelings and his desires for so long, became an angry alcoholic. My mother became his enabler, and we children learned to walk on eggshells in our own home. And that brings us to our third and perhaps most critical lesson on the road to recovery. The truth is, enabling like addiction is a hereditary disease. Left untreated, enabling is hereditary. It goes from generation to generation, and we are living proof. The truth is, I did not end up married to an addict by mistake. If I had not found Edward, I would have kept searching until I found an addict to marry. That addiction enabler relationship is the only family relationship I had ever known. It was the only way I knew how to be. My brothers fulfilled the alcoholic side of that. We girls became enablers extraordinaire. Please know that we are in no way blaming our parents. They were great people who loved us and gave us so much. Everything they did because they thought it was the right thing to do. But then that's the point. That's exactly what I did to my own husband, and that's exactly what I would have done to my own child if I had not been brought so low by my own enabling that I was left with only myself to look at and no addict left to blame.
You know, we were giving this presentation to Jim Van Hecke a few months ago, and a law enforcement official approached us. And I love law enforcement, they're wonderful. He wanted our advice and our input on how he could have handled a situation better. He went on to share that he received a 911 call from a woman who'd reported being emotionally and physically abused by her husband. And sure enough, when he arrived at the home, he was greeted by an incredibly intoxicated and belligerent man who greeted law enforcement into his home as if they were family and directed them to a poor woman, thin and frail, hunched over in a wheelchair, crying. This was his wife. And as the law enforcement officer went over to talk to her, he quickly identified she was a victim. After talking with her just a little bit more, he found that she had been emotionally and physically abused. So he turned to arrest her husband. And miraculously, she shed her victim exterior and moved into the role of hero. And said, "Oh no, He said he was sorry. Please don't take him away. Things will be different as soon as you leave. He'll calm down. Everything will be okay. So the law enforcement officer, confused, turned back to the woman and said, well, is there someplace safe we can take you? A friend, a family, a relative. I don't want to leave you here. Quickly, she stopped being the hero and she moved into the role of martyr. Said, no, I'll be fine. He needs me. Soon he'll be sober, and I need to stand by my man. So the truth is, when the law enforcement officer asks what he could have done, there's not much. Because what he needs to realize, and what society needs to realize, is that that woman, that enabler, is every bit as diseased as the belligerent alcoholic that answered the door. And all we can do is treat that person exactly like we would an addict. Help them understand their choices. Allow them to make their own decisions. And allow them to deal with the consequences of their actions. Because you see, it is only when an enabler no longer feels the need to be a victim, a hero, or a martyr in their own story, that their recovery can actually begin. It is only when people, just like they do with addicts, stop interfering with our lives and the messes we create of them. And believe me, there are not enough pages in a book to tell you the messes we have made of our lives. Until people stop interfering, we never hit our bottom. We never start that road to recovery. That's the biggest goal of our book, is to help society and to help all of you realize that enabling is truly a disease, and a disease that stands all on its own. And when you reach out and you help the enabler, you stand one of the best chances to truly help the addict and truly stop the addiction and the enabling from breeding through generations to come. Ironically, my recovery came from my first husband, Doug. Once again, I came home from work to find a scene that I had found so many times before. And you're all going to be able to relate to this, because if you've ever dealt with an addict, this is the scene in everyone's home. I walked through the door after work to find a husband half in the bag, an empty bottle of vodka, and 2 maxed out credit card bills. And I'd walked through the door and I've seen this so many times, but I always reacted the same. Surprised, shocked, couldn't believe this had happened. And I started immediately to yell and to scream and become hysterical. Didn't he understand how hard I worked? Didn't he understand what it took to keep his credit clean, to feed him, to clothe him, to put a roof over his head? How could he be so ungrateful when I worked 2 jobs doing this all for him? Now, our typical dance in this was about 2 words into my argument, Doug would jump in and begin to scream back at me. And I guess our goal was whoever was louder, we were hoping, would win the argument. Never did, never changed. It was the same old song and dance. But for some reason, this time was different. Doug never engaged. He just sat there and listened to me and let me go on about my head, crying hysterically, until I finally wore myself out and got quiet. And then he looked right at me, calmly and collectively, and said, "You're an effing lunatic. Who asked you?" And I don't know why. Maybe it's because he was calm. Maybe it's because he was cool. But the light bulb went off. And I thought, oh my God, he's right. Who asked me? Who asked me to feed him? Who asked me to clothe him? Who asked me to pay his bills? He never did. And quite frankly, even if he had, it didn't matter. I was an adult. I
the ability to say no. And it was in that moment that the biggest irony of my life occurred. I had devoted my life trying to save this sweet, sick man. And in that moment, he saved mine. Because that was the moment that my recovery began. And it occurred to me on that day and through my recovery that my life wasn't a mess because I had married Doug. Just remove him from the picture, and I would have run as fast as I could to find another addict to put in there. My disease was my disease, and my disease alone. Now together, we didn't make a very good combination. But my life was a mess because I'd made it a mess. And that was the day, again, that my recovery began. And I'd love to tell you that the road on my recovery was easy. But it wasn't. It was long and it was crooked. And the reason it was long and it was crooked is because not much is out there for enablers. And I live in Asheville, North Carolina. And if you want to get therapy, if you want to try something alternative, if you want to try something crazy, it's in Asheville. I've screamed into pillows. I've chanted all day long. I've laughed from 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But no therapy ever pointed out to me, truly, my disease as standalone as an enabler. Now, I entered Al-Anon and I read Codependency No More. Fabulous. But they weren't enough because they did more to help me understand understand the addict in my life and to understand my relationship to him at the time. But they didn't do a lot to help me understand my disease as an enabler. So again, the greatest irony of my life is that my sweet, alcohol-addicted, diseased husband, who I wanted more than anything to save, still had enough wits about him to be the one person in my life who called me on my stuff and who pointed out to me that I was as diseased and twisted and confused as he was. And he put me on the road to recovery.
That's why we wrote the book and why we wanted to share our story. We knew that enablers needed both a practical guide of how to deal with the legal, medical, and financial challenges of dealing with an addict or alcoholic. But at the same time, they needed an emotional support piece that would provide both the reasoning and steps to put their lives back together. And since we've been doing this for 30 years, over 6 addicts, we felt we had the experience and the knowledge to do it. What we are doing here today and why we are sharing our message with you is to ask you, the treatment community, to see the treatment of enablers as crucial to recovery. There are an estimated 23 million people in the United States who suffer from substance abuse. Double or triple that number, and you have the number of the family members suffering right along with them. If you think about it, that's 70 million people enabling addiction. Basically, they are out there undoing the very work you do. And they have no idea that they are doing anything wrong. In fact, quite the opposite. And they have no idea how to stop. When you think about the power that helping those enablers can have, the benefits are limitless. You provide a better environment in which the addicts can recover. You stand the best chance of the disease not going into the next generation. And you put your time and energy into a person whose mind and body are not clouded from substance abuse.
Treat the enabler and you starve the addiction. Can you all get to your feet? And I'd love for you to say that line with us. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Treat the enabler, starve the addiction. You know, my work as a trainer and a professional speaker has taught me that less than 5% of people who sit in an audience actually take action
with from what the speaker ever says. And that may seem like a small number, but to tell you the truth, if just 3 or 4 of you in here today took what you heard, took what you learned, and started programs that specifically addressed the enabler, the impact and the difference that you could make would be incredible. Because when you treat the enabler, you truly starve the addiction, and you stop it from breeding for generations to come. So take a moment and look around this room, because 3 or 4 of you will take this information, and 3 or 4 of you will take action. And to those 3 or 4 who do, my sister and I thank you. Thank you for the difference you'll make in our lives. Thank you for the difference that you'll make in the lives of our children. And thank you for the difference that you'll make for generations to come. Thank you.